we're going to talk about how to internationalize your domestic issue. Because for a lot of people coming into the CSW space, it can sometimes be the first time that they've had to think through the issues that they work on in a domestic context in what's actually a very different context, a context where the language might be different, where the key issues might be different, and where the way an issue is framed might require you to look at things a little bit differently. So let's have a quick look at how you internationalize your issue. And I'm just going to hide my self view because it's very distracting to look at yourself while you're trying to talk to people. There we go. Okay, so if you are moving from your domestic issue to your international issue, some of the things that you need to consider are the language that's used in the international space and how that might be different to the language that you're used to using in the domestic space, particularly terms that have an accepted usage that is maybe not tremendously well articulated. And then terms that have very, very well articulated meanings, so definitional terms, where the definition might have been spelled out over a number of different reports or documents over time. Terms of art, particularly you can get different terms of art that are used differently in different regions, and you know, variations on terms that are being used by more progressive movers in the space to move an issue forward, so a variation on a term. And previously agreed language, and we've talked a little bit about previously agreed language already when we were talking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the other documents in the climate space. So one of the things that's critical in the negotiation space at CSW is that you've got a number of people sitting in a room representing state entities who have a number of competing agendas, a number of good intentions, and a number of unspoken desires or needs. And in that environment, one of the things that we often need to fall back to is what's called previously agreed language. So where you've got a document where states have previously agreed to a particular expression of something, that can be a useful fallback if the language, the more progressive or the more strident or the more limited language that's being proposed is not shifting in the negotiations. So if we're stuck for a way forward on the existing language, often what we do is we go to old documents and pull out similar language and use that instead. So previously agreed language is a really useful thing to get your head around if you've got a particular area of interest. Other things you need to keep in mind when you're moving from domestic to international are the difference between your national context and regional contexts. So the work that's being done in your region around the issue that you're interested in, and then thinking about what your region comprises, because many people's regions actually can comprise different groupings. So for instance, for Australia, there are a number of different regions we could be thinking about. We could be thinking about our Pacific neighbours, or we could be thinking about our Asian neighbours, or we could be thinking about the Asia Pacific. And they're not necessarily the same conversations, and they're definitely not the same set of documents that you might be looking at. There may be very different material coming out of different permutations of a region. Then again, in Australia, you might also be looking at what's coming out of the EU or what's coming out of the UK, or in some cases the US, because they are nations who have similar economic and political structures to us and a shared history of Western colonialism, let's face it. And so there are a number of different ways that you can think about what region you should be thinking about. Regional documents are really quite critical in the CSW process, as Carol was saying earlier, because they can provide that nuance which pushes back against the westernisation of UN processes. So really have a look at those regional documents and whether or not they're useful to you. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is absolutely critical, is that the role that you play on your issue in a domestic space may be very different to the role that you can usefully play on your issue in an international space. In particular, you really need to do a lot of work on blocking your own privilege, the access and opportunity that other women have in the space, understanding the differences between the way that your issue manifests domestically with the way it manifests domestically in other countries can be really important. And identifying the opportunities to promote those voices wherever you can. I believe very strongly that the move from domestic to international language should always come with one eye on how can I benefit people other than the people in my country. Because the point about moving into that international area is that you are moving into a space where we are all in a global context looking after each other. And so, looking for those opportunities to promote other activists and looking very closely for opportunities to listen to and learn from other activists is critical, even where that involves sitting with discomfort or sitting with anger. Where you can do that safely within yourself, that's a critical and important thing that you can do. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one local issue that's currently on the agenda in Australia and look at how you'd internationalise that going into, for example, the CSW space. So let's look at affordable and appropriate housing for women, something that ERA works on a lot. And something that I imagine that a number of you have had an oar in over the years. When we're looking at housing for women, when we're talking about it in the Australian context, we talk about things like affordability, the appropriateness or accessibility of the properties, linkages with gendered violence, housing as a means of escaping violence, housing inaccessibility as a means of exacerbating or continuing violence. Lack of investment in social housing is a major political issue in that one in Australia. The market drivers of unaffordability, like tax policy or other economic factors. Gendered poverty is a key area under housing, how you access finance, and discrimination in the housing market. Those are the sorts of things that you might be talking about if you're a housing advocate in Australia or a gender equality advocate in Australia who's interested in housing. Take it into the international context and it can look really different. So housing for women in the international context might be about the right to own property or about inheritance rights. It might be about slum clearance. It might be about forced relocation and internal displacement. It might be about gendered poverty. It might be about accessing finance. In particular, rather than in Australia about whether you can get finance, but whether you are allowed to get finance. Linkages with gendered violence, discrimination, HIV/AIDS, natural disasters and climate change, and I would add to that military conflict as well. Investment in social housing and development. And the thing that's interesting about those two lists is that there's crossover between them. And that's one of the first things you should be looking for when you're trying to work out how you're going to do your shift from your issue domestically to your issue internationally. Where are the bits where you can talk from your experience that speak to the experiences of other women in other countries? And so we might be looking here at the gendered poverty piece as being somewhere where we could contribute really strongly. We might be looking at investment in social housing as being somewhere where we can contribute really strongly. But at the same time, we might also be needing to adapt the way we talk about those issues because investment in social housing in a developing country might have a lot to do with what role it plays within the broader developing economy than it does within Australia, which is more about where you put your dollar. Do you put it into male-dominated sectors of the economy, or do you put it into sectors of the economy that benefit women? So there are differences even where the broad headings are similar, but you are more likely to have something useful to contribute where there is that overlap between what you do in Australia and what's happening internationally. So the steps to internationalising your issue are really not that complicated, but they do take a little bit of investment, but it's investment that in the end is going to inform your domestic work and make it stronger. So it's worth doing. Firstly, know your domestic position well, and everybody's going to be fine on that. The place where that becomes really interesting is in an area like climate change, where some of us haven't been putting our attention in that area very strongly, or in an area where you suddenly realise that there is a much greater role for you in being an ally, where you really need to do some work first on understanding the issue domestically before you go on elsewhere. The second step is Google it. Read the papers on your issue that come from different regions and slightly differently to understanding your own region and being familiar with the papers and the documents that relate to your issue from your region, it's also important for you to be familiar with the key overarching headlines from other regions as well. So you can get a sense of who's going to be interested in what you've got to say, but also where you can be of use in other areas. Get used to the differences in language. Make lists. I have a number of glossaries that I keep so that I can manage to keep track of who's talking about what in which ways. I actually have one of those for domestic work too, because if you've got people talking about violence against women, sometimes the way they refer to housing is slightly different to the way that we refer to it from a gender equality perspective. And so getting used to those differences and being able to move fluidly between them is a key part. Fall back to human rights language, if for no other reason than because that's always under attack and it needs supporting. So that's always something useful you can do. And to the language of the Beijing Platform for Action is also another critical area, because human rights treaties, the subsequent materials that relate to human rights processes, and the Beijing Platform for Action are points of confluence. Baselines that everybody can come to. And so if you're familiar with those and you use that language, then people from other regions with different focuses are more likely to understand where you're coming from. It's your point of commonality. Interrogate your own assumptions and beliefs, and this is so important. Not just because we owe it to our sisters working in other areas to be really properly listening to what's being said, but also because your own work as a domestic advocate is going to be better if you're drawing on the experiences that women have had in other jurisdictions and other places of the world. One of the things that I really miss about the face-to-face CSW is learning how things are done elsewhere and working out which bits of that will be transferable across to Australia. So your assumptions and beliefs are going to get in the way of that really positive process. So get them out of the way, or at least be very aware of them and check in on them on a regular basis. And insist on high standards for everyone. One of the things that bothers me sometimes about the conversation about bringing CSW home to Australia is that sometimes when we talk about that, we sound like that's the reason why you would participate in CSW. There are two reasons to participate in CSW. The first one is to bring it home to Australia and improve things in Australia. But the second one, and in my view, the more critical one, is to take the privilege that we have sitting here as a country where we have made significant progress on gender equality in a range of areas, but not for all women, and to take that advantage and turn it into standard setting outside, because that's that process that Carol has talked so eloquently about this morning, where women got together and built CSW, and then built the documents that came out of CSW, and then built the conference process, and then built the documents that came out of the conference process, because everything that we've got is based on that. So that's a critical part of the process. So if we were looking, as an example, at housing, you'd start with, well, let's look at the human rights language and the Beijing Platform for Action language. So housing, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's there in Article 25. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. It's there in Article 1.1. And to be frank, at this point, you're in a Wikipedia search. It's not complex stuff. You're getting a list together of what your future reading is. It's also in the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, General Comment number 4 on adequate housing. It's in the Beijing Platform for Action, and it's in the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Article 12. And so that's understanding that that's your baseline. That's the point that you will have in common with every other woman on the planet, is that those documents set the baseline standard. Once you've done your Wikipedia search and worked out what they are, then you need to start looking at what they say. If you're in Australia and you're talking about housing, you might start by saying the federal government needs to consult on the housing needs and barriers that are faced by a diverse range of women when they develop a national housing and homelessness strategy. So there are two things you're asking for there. You're asking for a national housing and homelessness strategy, which, by the way, doesn't exist in Australia, just pointing that out. And you're saying that when you do that, it needs to have a good, strong gender lens that is properly intersectional. So if I was talking to other advocates, as I am here, that's the way I frame that. When I talk to the government, I frame it in those terms, in terms of an action that I want the government to take. Internationally, it looks a little bit different. States must develop national housing strategies which reflect a process of extensive, genuine consultation with a broad diversity of women, particularly women facing multiple and intersectional disadvantage. And the terms that are in italics are either terms of art or defined terms in the housing space, in the international space. So you can see the language is different, but we're actually asking for the same thing. We're asking for some sort of national housing strategy, and we're asking for it to have a gender lens, which is properly intersectional. So the language is different. The basic concept is not necessarily any different. We talked earlier on today about some of the key CSW language issues, and I'm not going to go into those in any detail now because we've already been there. But when we're looking at climate and housing, one of the things is that there is an extra dimension to it, not necessarily in terms of the practical outcomes that you're seeking, but an extra dimension in terms of the types of language you might be able to use, the number of hooks you might have to hang what you want to ask for on, and the number of allies that you might have in relation to the work. So the effort that you'll need to expend to go out into that space and understand its language is, in my view, more than offset by the benefits that you get from being able to have this whole other area to play in. So in the domestic version of housing, we might be housing and climate change. We might be looking at gendered poverty and homelessness, planning and infrastructure, land release, sustainable design, design for health, planning permissions, infrastructure. We might be looking at market vulnerability to climate change. We might be looking at the impact of construction practices on carbon emissions. We might be looking at housing precarity, homelessness following disaster. And I generated that list just by going to the media in Australia and working out what people are talking about when they talk about housing and climate change in Australia. You can get, by going the next level in and looking at the reports that are being written or looking at the materials that are being generated by other NGOs working in this space already, you can get a much tighter set of intersections there. So, for example, you might be, if you go into the reports, you might start to see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing has very specific issues about being located near a reliable source of water. That there are issues around the design and maintenance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, particularly in light of climate change. So the more you go into this, the more you'll get, but let's stay at a high level now. The international version can be found in the Human Rights Committee's Resolution 4314 from 2020. States must take the right to adequate housing into account for strategies for adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, and work with affected communities and individuals to develop and promote environmentally sustainable and sound housing design, construction and maintenance to address the effects of climate change while ensuring the right to adequate housing. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this compared with the previous list of housing areas is that there is more overlap between the Australian domestic housing advocacy and the international housing advocacy when climate change is a factor. And that's because we are not as advanced on climate change, or we are nowhere near as far ahead of other states on climate change as we might be on other areas of gender equality. And so if you're working in that climate change space, you are much more likely to be finding that you're working with the status quo and the mainstream on your issue. There is some climate language available to you in CSW 60 and 62, which I won't go into in any detail now, but just be aware that that's available to you. But it mainly focuses on adding a gender lens to policy around mitigation and adaptation and disaster response, so a gender lens, and women's role in decision-making and leadership and as a stakeholder in climate change responses. So the language in CSW is pretty limited around that. So look elsewhere when you're looking to internationalise your issue if it's not covered by those two. I'm going to stop there just quickly and see whether anybody else has any questions that they would like to ask about that. I've got one chat comment. Lee L. Brown is asking, do we also use the 10 commitments from Copenhagen Declaration? Anything you can get your hands on, actually, Lee. There is a hierarchy of language. When you're in a particular process, the best language you can get is language that's come out of that process previously. So previous language from agreed conclusions at CSW is by far your preferable. Then language from other consensus documents from UN bodies is the next level. So language that comes out of, for example, the COP agreement is also good. Particularly, except that that's a highly politicized space. But in terms of things that people have agreed to previously, that's what you're looking for. Particularly if you're talking to a particular state, what have they agreed to previously? Which processes were they involved in? Then it goes out from there. So research papers and work by UN entities is also highly regarded, but is not technically agreed language, unless it's very definitional and has involved lots of consultation with states, in which case it might start to look more like agreed language. So things like the Copenhagen commitments, yes, but it will have increasingly less or more impact depending on which environment you're operating in. So if you're doing gendered stuff in relation to the Enhanced Lima program on gender equality and climate change, you would find that the CSW language is not quite as convincing as COP language. And language that comes out of the environmental space would have more sway in that space. So pick your targets and make sure you do the reading about the process that you're interested in first, because that's going to be core. Any other questions? Just take your mic off and jump in if you like. And in that case, I'm now going to hand over to Juliana to talk about this new environment we're in and how one actually goes about engaging in it. So Juliana, over to you.
Over to me. Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you, Carol, for both of you for this morning and this afternoon as well. It's actually been very empowering and mind-blowing as well. But I'm going to talk to you about experiences. And I was telling Helen and Carol earlier that I think as our environment has changed so much that sometimes one doesn't think they've got the capacity to be able to bring to bear what they think they know. But let me reflect with you on 26 years ago. And for that reason, I want to acknowledge and affirm all Beijing veterans on this platform, because I went to Beijing in 1995 from Australia. And I went as one of the 2 plane loads of people that descended on Beijing from Australia. And let me tell you that the women from Australia were very well versed in the platform, in the forward-looking document, in CEDAW, and in their preparations. We took a good 9 months to prepare for Beijing, when right now we haven't got even 2 months to prepare. But I know that everybody who's been thinking about CSW all year round has been thinking about the document, the zero report, and everything else that has been going on. I'm talking to you about the CSO space, which was a very exciting space. So if I take you to Beijing, the CSO space was 36,000 women in a town in Huairu outside of Beijing. 36,000 women. A couple of weeks ago, somebody said to me in some forum, the person said to me, were you there when Hillary Clinton was speaking in Beijing? I said, yeah, we were there with our umbrellas on in that rain because we couldn't get into the room. So that is what women have done in the NGO CSO space. It is a space that we cannot take for granted, because it is the space and the point at which people make things happen in the decision making. We enforce the decisions that are coming through. So we hear from our government representatives, and then we go to caucus and we look at the documents and we send language and information through to them in order that they can get a space for us. It is a space that is quite powerful and influential. So when I come and when I hear people talk about in January and they start talking about, I'm going to CSW, these are the questions that come to my mind. Are you? What are you going to do? Who are you going to go with? As in, what is your group? What is your course? What course are you carrying? Who is with you from Australia and who are you linked to overseas? That when you get there, you're going to be talking to and caucusing and making frames and articulating language that can support your position here and worldwide. And then, so this morning, Helen was talking about YWCA. I was a board member of YWCA Australia, and a lot of work gets done in that space. YWCA goes and they link up. Soroptimist goes and they link up with Soroptimist International. UN National Council of Women links in with other groups. So there are women who know why they are going. And then there are others who are like, we're going to CSW, and you're like, or for. So because now it's a digital space, it's an important space for us to do more work and to link with more people. When I reflected on what you do in CSW NGO space, or NGO, CSW, CSO space, what you do is you grow networks. That is a very powerful place to grow networks. It means that if you have a course that you are working on, when I went to Beijing, and since then, the course that I worked on were 2 courses, and I carried them like they were in my portfolio, they were in my suitcase. I was carrying refugee women, and I was carrying female genital mutilation. Now, I'm going to tell you 2 stories because my way of presentation is by stories, and I hope you never forget my stories. So on the point of female genital mutilation, in that space, there were about more than 100 sessions on female genital mutilation. When I got the book, I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Which one am I going to go to? So there were days when I went from FGM seminar to FGM seminar to FGM seminar. And then I realized very quickly, everybody who was speaking from the angle of what happens on the continent of Africa. Then I grew frustrated because I wasn't hearing from anybody who was working in a Western society like I was on FGM. So one day I just put out a notice on one of the seminar walls to say, who lives in a Western country and is working on this, put your name down. And very quickly we were able to form a meeting where we linked up and we created a network of people working in Western countries on FGM. And then we followed up from there. So right up till now, over 20 odd years, I'm still in link with people in Europe and the work that they are doing, and to update ourselves around the work that is being done for migrant communities on FGM. Let me also revert us quickly to the word, the stuff around language. Helen, thank you for all that international stuff on language. But I think one of the things that we should notice, and I really noticed that very quickly in when we were going to ESCAP in 2019, that some of us didn't understand that what makes sense to us in Australia doesn't really make sense overseas. Like, it doesn't work. Like when you say migrant women, even in our region, migrant women are women who leave their countries and they go and work in domestic work in other countries. In Australia, we see migrant women as people who are immigrants into Australia. So those kind of language, culturally and linguistically diverse, is like, what? It doesn't appear anywhere. So when we go into these spaces, we need to monitor the language we use internally as to how it relates overseas. So we grow networks that way. We make a lot of friends. We make friends for life, literally. And last year when we were having this training, there was a video that was played by Carol, and in the video was one of our friends who was reflecting on Beijing for 25 years. It was quite a cathartic moment for me because I knew the work that we had done in that process. And I had to put off my phone and had a long, good cry because it ignited a lot of stuff within me. We make a lot of good friends. And let me tell you, that the other cause that I was carrying, refugee women, was one that I'm very proud of, because in Beijing, we had a meeting with UNHCR for refugee women. And there was a woman there who had come into the conference from Sudan. She was on crutches. And I noticed her because she was on crutches and she was wearing like an army uniform. And I was like, who is this? Why is she here with her crutches? Why can't she just stay at home? But she made a comment. She asked the question to the UNHCR, and I didn't like the response from the UNHCR. So I retorted. And after the meeting, I caught up with her and I gave her a key ring because we carry tokens with us physically to the space. And she carried that token, that key ring, for 10 years. She was resettled in Adelaide, and she kept asking people, do you know the woman who gave me this key ring? And one day, after 10 years, I was in a meeting and I spoke, and she just flew at me and said, that was you. So we had a conversation. What happened after that meeting? And what happened after that meeting was a whole opening up of opportunity for refugee women from Africa, from the Sudan especially, to come to Australia. So, you know, those kind of, yeah. But then we are now going to a virtual space. Does that mean that we should shut up? No, no, no. It actually means that we have a great opportunity opening up for us. The virtual opportunity is amazing because it allows migrant and refugee women in the region to be encouraged to attend regional sessions. So you will know that you have the Africa region, the MENA region, the European region. So what I do in my area of work is to encourage women to apply to attend CSW NGO Forum and ensure that they attend those regional meetings so that they can understand what's happening in the region, so that they can bring it to the discussion that we have with migrant and refugee women at home. If it was physical, if it was face-to-face, we would have been able to go into those spaces, especially because people have language and they have cultural nuance, and they can then participate in those spaces and support Australia in that sense. We need to really be savvy and search out what is going on in those spaces. And then linking up and influencing is also an important thing that we do at CSW NGO. It's not all about wearing clothes and dancing and enjoying. That's a great part of it, but we can't do it digitally. We might do it in the conversations, but it's very important to attend those spaces. Organizing before you go is so powerful. I'm big on that. I'm very big on that. But that is what I'm trying to move us back to in Australia. Those 9 months of organizing before Beijing was incredible. And I think we really need to get the alliances to really push us along those lines to really organize the grassroots voices from Australia into the international space. So can I ask for a minute, Helen, if you can put up the accesses for this year? So there is a registration to attend, to listen in to the state processes, and then there is the registration for the NGO CSW forum. That costs us nothing. We need to be able to get people to register so that they get in. I know it will be like a lot of sleepless nights. I'm a sleeper, I'm a day person, but I make sure that I attend those, because what you do is that you get an opportunity to look at all the participants and you pick out the participants that you want to link up with. So it's all open for you. You go onto the portal and you pick up the participants that you want to link up with. You attend the meetings and you pick up the people that you want to work with. Carol and I worked for a very long time with African women in Australia, and we run African Women Advocacy Training Program. Through that program, we were able to get Australian National Committee on Refugee Women to send refugee women to the UNHCR EXCOM meetings. And now it's become a space for all refugees who are resettled around the world to gather and to form strong networks that influence processes around settlement and around living in camps, IDPs around the world. But as we went on through that process, we realized that people's issues in resettlement in Australia were not issues for UNHCR. They were beyond resettlement. They were about settling in the country, the third country of settlement. So in that space, the women's issues then shift into CSW. And on that basis, we are working with African Women Australia this year around the elimination of violence against women, so we can link those voices into CSW. So here, that's all that I'm going to talk to you about. Make sure that you register into the NGO CSW forum. Make sure that you are registered. Make sure that you can get into the forum. Make sure you can participate in the parallel events. This year, I have 2 parallel events that have been accepted, one on climate change and one that I'm moderating around the review theme, because I think that review theme for me is so powerful. So I'm making sure that people link up with us. That one, we are linking with Colombia. We are linking with partnership with women in Colombia, indigenous women in Colombia, and empowering women in entrepreneurship. Whatever you do here can be reflected in the world. So make sure that you get your voice heard and the voices of other people. And then when you are going, make sure you're not going as an individual, because this is not an individual space. If you have got an individual issue, this is not the space for it. Every individual issue needs to be directed into national regional issue before we take it international. That is the process, and Carol showed us that process very clearly today. So whatever work you are doing in Australia, think about how you can globalize it. Think about how you can direct it into the international. Use the language as Helen has just shown us, so that next year, if we get the world open up and we are going to CSW, then physically we're going, but in our head, we're going to link up and make sure that gender equality is actually what we are building upon, what has been built for us. So thank you.